Millionaire gave $500 to an elderly woman at the church door. The next day, he found her praying at his long-lost son's grave. 9 years later, pack your things and leave. Today is your last day. Jonathan Pierce's cold words cut through the silence of his luxurious office on the 50th floor of Pierce Enterprises. Outside, snow was falling over Hartford, Connecticut, creating a deceiving, peaceful scene through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Frank Wilson, 65, stood trembling before the massive mahogany desk. "But Mr. Pierce, it's Christmas Eve. I've served this company for 9 years. And now you're too slow, too old. We need young blood." Jonathan adjusted his Rolex watch, not even bothering to look at Frank. "Security will escort you out." "You've changed so much since Michael's accident," Frank's voice cracked. "Your son would be ashamed of what you've become." Jonathan's head snapped up, his steel blue eyes blazing. "Don't you dare mention my son." "I have to, because there's something you need to know." Frank pulled out an old envelope from his jacket. "I'm Jennifer's brother, your daughter-in-law, the one who disappeared after Michael died." The revelation hit Jonathan like a physical blow. His hands gripped the desk's edge until his knuckles turned white. Memories he'd suppressed for 9 years came rushing back. The screeching tires, the phone call at midnight, Michael's broken body in the hospital, Jennifer's tear-stained face at the funeral, and then nothing. She vanished, pregnant with his grandchild. "Get out," Jonathan whispered, his voice dangerous. "Get out!" As Frank left, something fell from the envelope, a faded photograph. Jonathan picked it up with trembling hands. It showed Michael sitting at a piano, teaching music to underprivileged kids at the local church. His son's smile, so full of life and kindness, pierced through 3 decades of carefully constructed walls. Jonathan stormed out of the office, ignoring his secretary's reminder about the board meeting. The elevator descent felt suffocating. He needed air. Outside, the bitter December wind whipped at his expensive coat. He walked quickly past a group of homeless people huddled near the building's entrance, deliberately averting his gaze from their outstretched hands. "God bless you, sir," one of them called out. Jonathan walked faster. His path took him past St. Patrick's Church, where Michael used to volunteer. He hadn't stepped foot in a church since the funeral. The old stone building stood defiant against modern skyscrapers, its steps covered in fresh snow. Something made him stop. A sound. No, a melody. The same melody Michael had composed for those children years ago. But that was impossible. Nobody knew that song except... The music drew him closer to the church steps. Through the swirling snow, he saw them. An elderly woman in threadbare clothes, and beside her, a little girl with a violin playing Michael's song. The woman's dignity struck him first. Despite her obvious poverty, she sat straight-backed on the cold steps, her silver hair neat under a worn hat. The girl couldn't be more than 8, her small fingers red with cold as they moved across the violin strings. But it was her eyes that stopped Jonathan's heart. Crystal blue, exactly like Michael's. "That song," he found himself saying. "Where did you learn it?" The little girl stopped playing, looking up at him with those haunting eyes. "My mommy taught me. She said my daddy wrote it." The elderly woman coughed, a harsh sound that spoke of illness she was trying to hide. "Sarah, sweetheart, we should go in. It's getting colder." Jonathan reached for his wallet, pulled out $500. "Here, take this." "We don't need charity," the woman said firmly. "Just prayers." But Jonathan saw her hands shaking, noticed the thin jacket on the little girl. "Sarah, could it be? Consider it a Christmas blessing," he insisted, his voice softer than it had been in years. As he walked away, the melody followed him. For the first time in 9 years, Jonathan Pierce felt something crack in his frozen heart. Little did he know, this encounter would change everything. The next morning, the snowstorm intensified over Hartford. Grace Sullivan huddled closer to her granddaughter on the church steps, wrapping her thin shawl around Sarah's shoulders. They had spent another night in the church basement, but the daytime rules required them to stay outside between services. "Grandma, I'm cold," Sarah whispered, clutching her violin case. "The morning choir practice starts soon, sweetheart. Just hold on a little longer." Grace suppressed a cough, not wanting to worry Sarah. Inside the church, the children's choir was gathering. Despite their circumstances, Grace had maintained her role teaching music to homeless children, creating a small ray of hope in their difficult lives. "Mrs. Sullivan, will you lead us today?" Father Michael called from the entrance. Grace nodded, helping Sarah up. As they entered the warmth of the church, Sarah quickly joined the other children. Grace watched with pride as her granddaughter took her place at the front, her voice rising clear and pure above the others. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The hymn filled the church, but suddenly Sarah switched to a different melody. The one she'd played yesterday, the same song that had caught Jonathan Pierce's attention. "Sarah, honey," Grace called out, "where did you learn that song?" "Mom used to sing it to me. She said Dad wrote it for poor children." Grace felt her chest tighten, and not just from her worsening condition. Jennifer had sung that song often during her college years, before meeting Michael, before everything changed. The church doors opened and Jonathan Pierce walked in. He stood at the back, transfixed by the singing. Sarah's voice, so similar to Michael's, echoed through the sacred space. "That song," he said, approaching Grace. "My son wrote it, Michael Pierce." Grace steadied herself against a pew. "You're Michael's father?" Before she could say more, a coughing fit overtook her. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, and Jonathan noticed the spots of blood she tried to hide. "You need medical attention," he said. "What I need is faith," Grace replied firmly. "And Sarah needs stability." Jonathan pulled out his wallet again, but Grace stopped him. "Money isn't the answer to everything, Mr. Pierce." Sarah finished the song and ran to her grandmother. "Did you hear me, Grandma? I remembered all the words." "You sing just like your father," Jonathan said softly. Sarah's eyes widened. "You knew my daddy?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Grace placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder, but the girl was already reaching for something around her neck. A silver medallion. "Mommy gave me this before she went to heaven. She said it was from Daddy." Jonathan's face went pale. He recognized the medallion immediately. He had given it to Michael on his 16th birthday, and Michael had later given it to Jennifer. "Sarah," Grace interrupted, "it's time for your violin practice." As Sarah skipped away, Jonathan turned to Grace. "Who are you? How does she know that song?" "Mr. Pierce, there are some things better left in the past." "Not this, not her." His voice cracked. "Please." Before Grace could respond, a sharp pain shot through her chest. She grabbed the pew for support, her vision blurring. "Mrs. Sullivan!" Father Michael rushed forward as Grace swayed. "I'm fine," she insisted, but her legs gave way. Jonathan caught her before she hit the floor. Sarah's scream echoed through the church as she ran back to her grandmother. "Call an ambulance," Jonathan ordered, but Grace gripped his arm. "No hospitals. They'll take Sarah away." "Then let me help, please." Grace looked at her granddaughter's frightened face, then at Jonathan's pleading eyes. After 9 years of secrets, perhaps it was time for truth. "Sarah," she said weakly, "play your father's song again. Mr. Pierce needs to hear it one more time." As the familiar melody filled the church once more, 3 lost souls began their journey toward healing, though none of them knew just how deep their connection ran. "Open it," Sarah urged, holding out the medallion to Jonathan. They sat in Father Michael's office, where Grace had finally agreed to rest on the old couch. Jonathan's hands trembled as he took the silver piece. When opened, it played the first notes of Michael's melody, a musical jewelry box he'd had custom made. "Jennifer was my best music student," Grace said, her voice weak but determined. "That's how she met Michael. He would wait for her after choir practice, sitting at the piano for hours." "You were her teacher?" Jonathan leaned forward. At Hartford University? For 4 years, she had such talent. Grace paused to cough. Michael would come to all her recitals. They were so young, so in love. Until I destroyed everything, Jonathan whispered. A commotion outside interrupted them. Through the window, they saw men in suits posting notices on the church walls. "Not again," Father Michael said, rushing in. "They're really going through with it." "What's happening?" Jonathan asked. "Sterling Development. They bought the block. They're demolishing the church to build luxury apartments." Sarah clutched her violin case. "But where will our choir sing? Where will we sleep?" Grace added softly. Jonathan stood up. "I know Sterling. I can talk to them." "You don't understand," Father Michael said. "They've already started the eviction process. We have 2 weeks." Grace tried to stand but stumbled. Sarah ran to her side. "Grandma." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." But the pallor of her face told a different story. "You need a doctor," Jonathan insisted. "No." Grace's voice was firm. "They'll ask questions. About Sarah. About custody." "Mommy said Grandma's all I have left," Sarah said, opening her violin case. Inside was a worn photo, Jennifer in a graduation gown, standing between Grace and Michael. Jonathan stared at the photo. "This was at the university?" "The day she graduated," Grace confirmed. 6 months before the accident. Sarah began playing the melody again, but stopped suddenly. "Grandma, you promised to tell me about the angel." "Angel?" Jonathan asked. "Sarah has visions sometimes," Grace explained carefully. "She says her daddy visits her. He was here yesterday," Sarah said. "When Mr. Pierce gave us the money, Daddy was smiling." Jonathan felt his chest tighten. "What else did you see?" He pointed at you. He looked sad." Before Jonathan could respond, more shouting erupted outside. Through the window, they watched as workers began measuring the church grounds. "They're not waiting 2 weeks," Father Michael said grimly. Grace stood shakily. "We should go." "Where?" Jonathan demanded. "We always find somewhere." But as Grace took a step, her legs gave out completely. "Grandma!" Sarah screamed. Jonathan caught Grace again, feeling how light she was, how fever burned through her clothes. "No more arguments," he said. "You need help." "The choir," Grace whispered. "The children need—" "I'll handle it," Father Michael assured her. "Mr. Pierce is right. You need care." Sarah touched her medallion. "Daddy's here again." "What's he saying, sweetheart?" Grace asked weakly. "He says to trust his father." Jonathan made a decision. "I'm taking you to my penthouse. Both of you." "Mr. Pierce," Grace protested. "Jonathan," he corrected. "And this isn't charity. This is—" He looked at Sarah, at her familiar blue eyes. "This is family." As they helped Grace to his car, Sarah trailing behind with her violin, none of them noticed Frank Wilson watching from across the street, clutching an envelope containing truths that would change everything. The demolition crew continued their measurements, and above them, dark clouds gathered, promising more snow. But inside the old church, Michael's melody lingered, a ghost of memory echoing through halls soon to be destroyed, unless something or someone intervened in time. The next morning, Jonathan drove to Maple Grove Cemetery. He hadn't visited Michael's grave in years, but Sarah's mention of seeing her father had stirred something in him. As he approached the familiar headstone, he stopped short. Grace was already there, kneeling in prayer despite the cold. She'd left his penthouse early, leaving only a note saying she needed to keep a promise. "Every Tuesday," Grace said without turning. "For 9 years I've come here. Why? Because I owed him my life. Or rather, he owed me his." Grace stood slowly. "I never knew he was your son until yesterday." Sarah appeared from behind a nearby monument playing her violin. The melody drifted through the quiet cemetery, drawing other visitors' attention. "Tell me," Jonathan said. "It was a rainy day at the university. Michael was 7, visiting campus with Jennifer. He ran into the street after a ball. Grace closed her eyes, reliving the memory. I pulled him back just as a truck passed. Jonathan felt his legs weaken. That was you? Jennifer never knew either. She started taking my music classes years later, and when she introduced me to Michael as an adult, he didn't remember me. Why would he? He was just a child. Sarah's music stopped. Daddy saved someone too. Mommy wrote it in her letter. Letter? Jonathan turned sharply. What letter? I'm not supposed to tell. Mommy said to wait until my 8th birthday. Grace touched the headstone. Jennifer left instructions, specific things to be revealed at specific times. When is her birthday? Jonathan asked. Next week, Grace answered. December 25th. Christmas Day, Jonathan whispered. The same day he'd fired Frank Wilson. Suddenly, the sound of construction equipment shattered the peace. Even here, they could hear the crews starting work at the church. They're really going to tear it down, Sarah said, hugging her violin case. Unless someone stops them, Grace added, looking meaningfully at Jonathan. I'll make some calls. Will that help, Daddy? Sarah asked, then covered her mouth. I mean, Mr. Pierce? The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan stared at the little girl who'd unknowingly called him what he desperately wanted to be to her. Sarah, Grace said gently, why don't you play your father's song again? As Sarah began to play, a man approached them. It was Frank Wilson. I thought I'd find you here, he said. There's something you all need to see. He held out an envelope, yellowed with age. Jennifer gave me this before she disappeared, said to keep it safe until the right time. And this is the right time? Jonathan asked. Look at the church. Look at Sarah. Look at where we're standing. After 9 years, everything's coming together. Before Frank could hand over the envelope, a harsh wind blew through the cemetery, catching it. Sarah ran after it, weaving between headstones. Sarah, careful, Grace called out. But another coughing fit overtook her. Jonathan rushed to help Grace while Frank followed Sarah. The girl chased the envelope until it landed near a fresh construction fence. The cemetery's new neighbor, Sterling Development, was expanding here too. They're going to build over everything, Frank said as they caught up. The church, the cemetery entrance, all of it. Not if I can help it, Jonathan replied. But his phone buzzed with messages from his board. The company takeover threats were increasing. Sarah retrieved the envelope, but before she could give it to Frank, she froze, staring at something, or someone, none of them could see. Sarah? Grace called. Daddy says not yet, Sarah announced. We have to wait until Christmas. He says everything will make sense then. She tucked the envelope into her violin case next to her mother's letter. Grace swayed slightly, and Jonathan noticed fresh blood on her handkerchief. You need to rest, he insisted. There's no time, Grace replied. The children's choir. The church? First things first, Jonathan said, making a decision. Let's get you both home. My home. And then I'm going to make some very important calls. As they left the cemetery, Sarah played the melody one last time. The sound carried across the graves, past the construction fences, all the way to the church where their story had begun, and where it would either end in tragedy or triumph. Back in his penthouse, Jonathan made call after call while Sarah practiced her violin and Grace rested. His private investigator's report about Jennifer had just arrived, and his hands shook as he opened the file. Mr. Pierce, his investigator's voice crackled through the speaker. Jennifer Wilson Pierce died 2 years ago. Car accident in Ohio. Jonathan sat heavily in his chair. And before that, she worked as a music teacher in small towns, never staying long in one place, always using her maiden name, Wilson. Sarah's playing stopped abruptly. She stood in the doorway, violin clutched to her chest. Are you talking about my mommy? Grace appeared behind her, steadying herself against the wall. She should hear it too. She's old enough now. Jennifer was my daughter-in-law, Jonathan began. I know, Sarah interrupted. Mommy told me in her letter. The one I can't open until Christmas. There's more, Grace said, moving to sit down. Jennifer was my daughter. Jonathan stared at her. What? I gave birth to her when I was young, teaching music at the university. She grew up surrounded by music. Grace's voice cracked. When she met Michael in my class, it felt like destiny. The investigator cleared his throat through the speaker. There's something else. We found her diary. A courier arrived minutes later with a worn notebook. Grace recognized it immediately. She wrote in this every day. Jonathan began reading aloud. Today I tried to go back, stood outside Pierce Enterprises for hours. But Jonathan's heart has turned to stone since Michael died. How can I tell him about the baby? Sarah moved closer, touching the diary's pages. Mommy's words. There's more, Jonathan continued reading. Michael's father needs time to heal. The accident wasn't his fault, but he blames himself. One day, when the baby's older, maybe then. Grace took the diary, turning to a specific page. Read this part. Jonathan read, Dad saved someone today. A little boy ran into traffic, just like the woman who saved him when he was 7. He said it felt like repaying an old debt. I never told him it was Grace who saved him that day. Some secrets are meant to be revealed at the right time. Frank Wilson entered the room, having been called by Jonathan. She tried to tell me everything before she left, but I only understood pieces. The letters, Jonathan remembered. You said she left letters? Frank nodded, pulling out a stack bound with ribbon. One for each year. I tried to find you both, but Jennifer made me promise to wait. She was protecting Sarah, Grace explained, then doubled over coughing. Sarah ran to her grandmother. Grandma, you're sick again. Jonathan called his doctor immediately, but Grace waved him off. No time. The church demolition. Let me handle that, Jonathan said. You need help. Suddenly, Sarah swayed on her feet, her small face pale. I don't feel good. Grace caught her granddaughter, panic in her eyes. Sarah? Sweetheart? She's burning up, Frank said, touching Sarah's forehead. We need her medical history, Jonathan's doctor said, rushing in. Family health records. Everything's in storage, Grace whispered. When we lost the house, the letters, Frank remembered. Jennifer included medical records, but they're sealed until Christmas. That's 5 days away, the doctor warned. She needs treatment now. Sarah opened her eyes slightly. Daddy says wait. Everything at Christmas. He promised. Grace and Jonathan exchanged looks. The diary, the letters, Sarah's mysterious visions. Everything pointed to Christmas Day. We need to trust Jennifer, Grace said. And Michael. Jonathan made another decision. You're both staying here, under medical care, no arguments. Through the penthouse windows, they could see the church in the distance, where demolition crews were gathering. Time was running out on multiple fronts. Save the church, Grace pleaded. Save our home. Then we'll open everything on Christmas Day. Sarah clutched her violin, humming Michael's melody weakly. Daddy's song will help, he promised. As the doctor examined Sarah, Jonathan looked at the diary, the letters, and the faces of his newfound family. 9 years of secrets were unraveling, but time was not on their side. And somewhere between heaven and earth, Michael's promises waited to be fulfilled. You've lost your mind, Jonathan. Richard Sterling stood in the Pierce Enterprises boardroom, waving the proposal papers. Convert prime real estate into a homeless shelter? The board will never approve this. Jonathan stared out at the church through the boardroom windows. Construction crews were already setting up barriers around the building. It's not just a shelter, it's a community center with senior housing and a music school. A waste of money, another board member interjected. And speaking of waste, you moved 2 homeless people into your penthouse? The press will have a field day. Their family. Alleged family, Richard corrected. With no proof until Christmas, according to your own words. Meanwhile, our stockholders are panicking. Sterling Development is breathing down our necks with this hostile takeover. Jonathan's phone buzzed. A text from his doctor about Sarah's worsening fever. "I'm not asking permission," Jonathan said. "I'm telling you my decision." "Then we'll stop you legally." Richard slapped a document on the table. "The board is filing for an emergency injunction. You're emotionally compromised, making irrational decisions." Irrational? Like demolishing a historic church right before Christmas? Business is business. Speaking of which, Richard smiled coldly. Child Services is very interested in your situation. A sick child living with an ill grandmother, no legal custody arrangements. Jonathan's fist hit the table. "Are you threatening a child?" "I'm protecting our company. You have until tomorrow to withdraw your proposal, or things will get very unpleasant." Back at the penthouse, Grace was refusing medication. "I can't think clearly with those pills. Sarah needs me alert." "You need rest," Jonathan argued, but Grace pointed to the window. "Look." A crowd had gathered around the church. The children's choir, led by Father Michael, was singing Michael's melody. News cameras were arriving. "The community is fighting back," Frank explained, entering with more papers. "They've filed their own injunction against the demolition. They're claiming the church is a historic landmark." Sarah watched from her bed, still feverish but smiling. Daddy's song is helping. A nurse tried to take her temperature, but Sarah turned away. "No more tests, not until Christmas." "Sweetheart," Grace began. Mommy said, "Wait, the letters will explain everything." Jonathan's phone rang again. Sterling Development was threatening to bulldoze the church that night, injunction or not. "They can't do that," Frank protested. "They can and will." Jonathan grabbed his coat. "I need to get down there." "I'm coming too," Grace insisted. "You can barely stand." "That church is our home. Those children need us." Sarah tried to get up. "I want to play for them." "No, young lady." The nurse gently pushed her back. "Your fever's too high." Suddenly, all their phones buzzed simultaneously. Breaking news. Sterling Development had started demolition early, claiming structural emergency. On TV, they watched as bulldozers approached the church. The choir stood their ground, singing louder. "Dear God," Grace whispered. "Get me down there," Sarah pleaded. "Daddy's song can save it." He promised. Jonathan made a series of quick calls. "Frank, stay with them. I'm going to fix this." "How?" Grace asked. "By making a deal with the devil." Jonathan headed for the elevator. "Richard Sterling wants Pierce Enterprises? Maybe it's time to give it to him." "You can't," Frank called after him. "The company is your life's work." Jonathan looked back at Sarah, pale but determined in her bed, still humming Michael's melody. "No," he said quietly. "My life's work is right here. I just didn't know it until now." As the elevator doors closed, he heard Sarah's weak voice. "Daddy says you're doing the right thing." Outside, snow began falling again. The children's choir sang on, their voices rising above the sound of bulldozers. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, Michael's melody fought to save not just a building, but a family's soul. The next few hours would determine everything. "Stop the demolition!" Jonathan's voice boomed through a megaphone as he pushed through the crowd. "I have a new proposal." The bulldozers paused. Richard Sterling emerged from his car looking annoyed. "This is a waste of time, Pierce. Let me present my plan. 1 hour. That's all I ask." Inside the church, Jonathan set up his presentation while the choir children sat in the pews. Father Michael stood beside him, hope visible on his face. "The Michael Pierce Community Center," Jonathan began, showing the blueprints. "A self-sustaining complex that includes the restored church, senior housing, and a music school." "Completely." "Impractical," Richard scoffed. "The numbers say otherwise." Jonathan clicked to the next slide. "The tax benefits alone make it profitable. Plus, the PR value." His phone buzzed. Sarah's fever had spiked again. "You're distracted, Jonathan," Richard noted. Thinking about that sick little girl who may or may not be your granddaughter? The choir children whispered among themselves. They all knew Sarah, their talented young violinist. "She is my granddaughter," Jonathan stated firmly, "and she taught me something valuable. Sometimes the best investments aren't about money." Father Michael stepped forward. "The children have something to show you." The choir stood, but instead of their usual hymns, they began singing Michael's melody, the same one Sarah played. "What's this?" Richard asked. "My son's composition," Jonathan explained. "He wrote it for these children 9 years ago." Another buzz from his phone. Grace was being taken to the emergency room. "Enough theatrics," Richard snapped. "This property is worth millions. Your sob story won't change that." "Then let me buy it," Jonathan countered. "Name your price." "You don't have that kind of liquidity. Unless—" Richard smiled. "You're willing to sell Pierce Enterprises?" The church fell silent. Everyone knew what the company meant to Jonathan. His phone buzzed again. Sarah was asking for him. "Well?" Richard pressed. Jonathan looked at the children, then at his phone showing Sarah's weak smile and a message from Frank. "Draw up the papers." "Jonathan, no," Father Michael protested. "It's just a company," Jonathan said. "This is about family." Back at the penthouse, Sarah sat up when Jonathan entered. "Did Daddy's song help?" "Yes, sweetheart." "The church is safe." Grace was being wheeled in from the hospital, looking exhausted but relieved. "At what cost?" "Nothing I wasn't ready to lose." Jonathan sat between them. "The center will be built. The church stays." Frank arrived with architectural plans. "The contractors can start tomorrow, but what?" "The City Planning Commission needs proof of community support." Sarah tried to stand. "I can play for them." "Not with that fever," the nurse warned. "The choir will help," Grace said. "They've always helped." Jonathan's phone rang. The board wanted an emergency meeting about his decision. "Go," Grace urged. "We'll manage." "No." Jonathan silenced his phone. "I've missed too much family time already." Sarah smiled weakly. "Daddy says you're learning." Outside, the demolition crews were leaving. The choir children gathered on the church steps, still singing Michael's melody. "Look," Frank pointed out the window. People were joining the choir. First a few, then dozens. The song spread through the crowd. "The community is speaking," Father Michael said from the doorway. Jonathan watched as news cameras captured the scene. Even Richard Sterling looked uncomfortable as reporters questioned him about demolishing a beloved community landmark. "It's working," Grace whispered. Sarah played her violin softly from her bed, joining the distant chorus. "3 more days until Christmas," she reminded them. "Until we can open Mommy's letters." "And learn the whole truth," Frank added. Jonathan looked at his newfound family, at the church being saved by a song, at the company he was willing to sacrifice. "The truth," he said, "is right here." The melody floated up from the streets below, a bridge between past and future, between loss and redemption. And in a penthouse above the city, a broken family began to heal, but time was still running out for some of them. 2 days before Christmas, Sarah's fever finally broke. She sat in the penthouse living room, surrounded by Frank's collection of Jennifer's letters. "It's not Christmas yet," Grace reminded her. "But it is my birthday," Sarah said. "And Mommy's first letter says, 'Open on Sarah's 8th birthday.'" Jonathan and Frank exchanged glances. Grace nodded slowly. With trembling fingers, Sarah opened the first envelope. Jennifer's diary fell out, along with a letter and medical documents. "Dear Sarah," Frank read aloud, "if you're reading this, you're 8 today. There's something you need to know about your father, Michael Pierce." Sarah clutched her violin. "Read more." Michael wasn't just a talented musician. He had a rare genetic condition affecting his heart. "The same condition you inherited, sweetie." Grace gasped. Jonathan grabbed the medical records. "That's why she's been sick," the doctor confirmed, reviewing the documents. "We can start proper treatment now." There's more, Frank continued reading. I never told Michael's father about you. After the accident, he changed. The kind man who supported Michael's music became cold, distant. I was afraid. Jonathan sank into a chair. She tried to tell me. That day at the office. The letter went on. But your father made me promise something before he died. He said when the time was right, his father would find us. Through music. Sarah played a few notes of Michael's melody. The song was a key, Grace realized. She taught it to Sarah knowing I'd recognize it, Jonathan finished. Frank pulled out another letter marked, for Grace. Grace read it silently, tears falling. She knew about my illness too, the same symptoms I had when she was young. She wrote, Mom, don't hide it like you did when I was a child. Let them help you. Why didn't you tell me you were sick back then? Jonathan asked. A single mother teaching at a university? I couldn't risk losing my job, my reputation. Sarah found another envelope marked, the church's secret. Inside was a deed. Frank examined it. This is, Jennifer bought the church, through a trust fund Michael set up before he died. What? Jonathan took the document. She used Michael's insurance money, Frank explained. The church legally belongs to Sarah. Then Sterling can't touch it, Jonathan realized. Sarah's the owner. Grace coughed violently. The doctor moved to help her. There's a letter for you too, Mr. Pierce, Sarah said, holding out an envelope. Jonathan read aloud. Dear father-in-law, if you're reading this, you found your way back to what matters. Michael always said music would heal your heart. He loved you until the end. Sarah played the melody again, stronger now. Wait, Grace said. There's something else about the song. She opened the diary to a marked page. Michael wrote this melody as a lullaby for our baby. He never knew it was a girl. Never knew we'd name her Sarah, after his mother. Jonathan stared at his granddaughter. She had his late wife's name. One last letter, Frank said, for Christmas Day. But why Christmas specifically? Jonathan wondered. Sarah closed her eyes. Daddy says it's when the biggest miracle happened. What miracle? Grace asked. Can't tell. Not until Christmas. Sarah smiled mysteriously. But Daddy says everything will change. Grace's coughing worsened. The doctor pulled Jonathan aside. Her condition is deteriorating faster than we thought. She needs immediate treatment. No hospitals, Grace insisted. Not until Christmas. Not until Sarah knows everything. But, Jonathan started. Trust Jennifer's plan, Grace said. Like she trusted that music would lead you back to your family. Outside, the church bells rang. Construction crews were preparing to start the renovation. Sarah played her father's melody, the notes floating through the penthouse like a prayer. 2 days until Christmas. 2 days until the final letter. 2 days to save what might be left of their newfound family. The truth was unfolding, but time was running out. Christmas Eve morning brought chaos. Jonathan's phone wouldn't stop ringing as Pierce Enterprises' stock plummeted. Sterling Development has 48% of the shares, his secretary reported. They're calling for an emergency board meeting, today. Before Jonathan could respond, Frank burst into the penthouse office. Child Services is here. What? Someone reported Grace's condition. They're questioning her fitness as a guardian. In the living room, 2 social workers were interviewing Sarah while Grace sat nearby, trying to control her coughing. Miss Sullivan, one worker said, given your medical condition and housing situation, I have housing, Grace interrupted. Mr. Pierce has no legal relationship to Sarah, the other worker stated. Without documentation, the Christmas letter, Sarah insisted. Tomorrow you'll see. Sarah needs immediate placement, the worker continued. Her medical condition requires stable care. Jonathan stepped forward. I'm her grandfather. Prove it. Sarah's violin slipped from her hands as she swayed suddenly. The doctor rushed to check her vitals. Her heart rate's elevated, he warned. The genetic condition, this is exactly our concern, the social worker said. She needs proper medical care. Now. Grace stood shakily. Please, just wait until tomorrow. The letters. But her words ended in a violent coughing fit. Blood stained her handkerchief. Call an ambulance, the doctor ordered. No, Grace pleaded. Sarah. Mrs. Sullivan needs emergency care, the social worker decided. And Sarah requires immediate placement in foster care. You can't, Sarah cried. Jonathan's phone buzzed again. Richard Sterling's message was clear. Back off the church project or I take everything. Frank pulled Jonathan aside. Sterling's behind this. He tipped off child services. Mr. Pierce, his secretary called urgently. The board vote starts in an hour. Without you there, Sterling takes control. The ambulance sirens wailed outside. Child services was preparing their paperwork. Stop, Sarah shouted. Daddy's song can fix this. She grabbed her violin, but her hands shook too. Badly to play. Grace reached for her granddaughter as the paramedics entered. Jonathan, the letter. In my Bible. Her eyes rolled back as she collapsed. Grandma! Sarah tried to run to her, but the social workers held her back. Get Mrs. Sullivan to the hospital, the doctor commanded. And Sarah needs to be admitted too. Her heart can't take this stress. I'll take her, Jonathan said. You have no authority, the social worker reminded him. Another urgent call. Sterling Development had started demolition at the church again, claiming the previous agreement was void. You have to choose, Jonathan. Richard Sterling's voice mocked through the phone. Your company or this fantasy family? Sarah broke free from the social workers, running to her violin case. The letters. They'll prove everything. But as she reached for them, she collapsed too. Sarah, Jonathan caught her. Daddy says, she whispered, don't give up. Christmas miracle. The paramedics rushed to help her. Grace was already on a stretcher. Mr. Pierce, his secretary pleaded. The board meeting. Sir, the social worker pressed. We're taking Sarah into custody. The church, Frank pointed to the TV news showing bulldozers. Jonathan stood in the middle of chaos, everything crumbling around him. His company, his family, his chance at redemption, all hanging by a thread. Sometimes, Sarah's weak voice came from the stretcher. You have to lose everything to get everything back. That's what Mommy wrote. The clock struck noon on Christmas Eve. In 24 hours, the final letter would reveal its secrets. If they could all hold on that long, I'll sign over Pierce Enterprises to Sterling Development, Jonathan announced in the hospital waiting room. But I have conditions. Richard Sterling leaned back in his chair. You're not in a position to make demands. The church property stays untouched. The community center gets built. And most importantly, child services backs off. That's a lot to ask. Take it or leave it. But remember, bad publicity about destroying a church at Christmas while evicting sick children, that won't help your stock prices. Sterling studied the contract. You're really willing to give up everything? Not everything, just what doesn't matter anymore. In the ICU, Sarah and Grace were in adjacent rooms. The doctors had discovered their conditions were related, a genetic heart problem that had skipped Jennifer's generation. Both need immediate surgery, the cardiac specialist explained. We can't wait. Frank arrived with Jennifer's Bible. Inside was another letter, marked, In case of emergency, open before Christmas. Jonathan read it aloud. If you're reading this early, something's gone wrong. There's a genetic test in the hospital records. It will prove what you need to know. The DNA results came back within hours. Sarah was indeed Jonathan's granddaughter. Grace was family too. I'm dropping the custody case, the social worker announced, but they both need surgery now. It's too risky, the doctor warned. Doing both procedures at once. Do it, Grace said weakly from her bed. Sarah first. No, Grandma, Sarah protested. Together or not at all. Jonathan made the decision. Together. And I'm covering all costs. With what money? Sterling asked from the doorway. You just signed everything away. Not everything. Frank held up the church deed. Sarah owns the property, and as her grandfather and legal guardian, Jonathan can leverage it. You planned this? Sterling realized. No, Jonathan smiled. But Michael did, 9 years ago. Sarah touched her violin. Daddy says, sing his song. Everyone together. The children's choir had gathered in the hospital lobby. As Sarah was wheeled into surgery, their voices carried Michael's melody through the halls. Grace reached for Jonathan's hand. If anything happens, save your strength. No, listen, Jennifer tried to come back, right after she left. But she saw you at Michael's grave, so angry, so cold. I drove her away. You were hurting too, but she knew someday you'd find your way back. Through Sarah, through the song. The surgeons came to take Grace. Wait, Frank said. There's something you should know. I'm not just Jennifer's brother. I was Michael's best friend. I promised him I'd watch over his family. All of his family. Jonathan hugged Frank. Thank you for keeping that promise when I couldn't. Daddy's song, Sarah called out as they wheeled her away. Don't stop playing until we come back. The choir sang louder. Hospital staff and patients joined in. The melody filled every corner of the building. Hours passed. Sterling paced the waiting room. You really love them, he finally said. More than anything I've ever owned. The deal's off. Keep your company. What? Consider it a Christmas gift. Besides, I don't want to be known as the man who destroyed a family on Christmas Eve. The surgeon emerged, smiling. They're both going to make it. The choir erupted in celebration. Through the window, dawn was breaking on Christmas Day. There's still one letter left, Frank reminded them. The Christmas miracle, Jonathan remembered. In recovery, Sarah opened her eyes first. Did you hear them singing? Everyone heard, Jonathan said. Good, because Daddy says the best part of his song hasn't been played yet. Grace woke up too, stronger than she'd been in years. The final letter waited in Sarah's violin case. In a few hours, its secrets would be revealed. But the real miracle had already happened. A broken family was whole again, and Michael's melody had shown them the way home. Christmas morning dawned bright over Hartford. In the hospital recovery room, Sarah sat up in bed, her violin in her lap. Time for the last letter, she announced. Grace, in the next bed, nodded. We've waited long enough. Jonathan and Frank gathered close as Sarah opened the final envelope. Inside was a music sheet and a letter. Dear Sarah, Frank read, if you're reading this on Christmas Day, then everything has happened as your father predicted. The song you've been playing? It's not complete. This is the final part, the part Michael wrote the day before the accident. Sarah studied the music sheet. It's a full orchestral arrangement. There's more, Frank continued reading. Michael knew he wouldn't live to perform this. He said someone else would finish his song. Someone who shared his gift, his blood, and his heart. The genetic condition, Grace realized. It didn't just pass down his heart problem. It passed down his musical talent, Jonathan finished. Sarah began to play the new section. The melody transformed, becoming something richer, more complex. A nurse rushed in. The children's choir is here. They're asking to sing with Sarah. Let them in, Jonathan said. As the children filed in, Sarah taught them the new parts. The song grew stronger, filling the hospital wing. Wait, Grace pointed to the letter. Look at the date Michael wrote this. December 25th, 9 years ago, Frank read. The day before the accident. Christmas Day, Jonathan whispered. He wrote this exactly 9 years ago today. Sarah played on, the choir following her lead. Hospital staff stopped to listen. Patients opened their doors. There's a P.S., Frank discovered. Michael wrote, Music heals what time cannot. When this song is finally complete, played by the one who carries my gift, everything will change. The center will rise, family will unite, love will win. Jonathan's phone buzzed. It was Richard Sterling. Turn on the news, Sterling said. On TV, crowds were gathering at the church. The demolition equipment was gone. In its place, construction crews were setting up, carrying the first materials for the new community center. "Consider it my Christmas gift to Hartford," Sterling said. "The permits are approved. Construction starts today." Grace wiped tears from her eyes. Jennifer knew. Somehow, she knew this day would come. Michael knew, Sarah corrected, still playing. He wrote it in the music. The choir grew louder. Down in the hospital lobby, more voices joined in. The song traveled through the building, out into the streets. Frank checked his phone. People are sharing videos of the choir online. It's going viral. The center needs a proper music school, Jonathan decided, with scholarships for kids who can't afford lessons. And housing for grandparents raising grandchildren, Grace added. Sarah finished the song with a flourish. The choir fell silent. "That's not the end," she said. Daddy wrote one more page, in the margin of the final sheet, in Michael's handwriting. "For the Christmas day when my father's heart opens again, when he finds what he lost, when the song brings us all home." Jonathan sat at Sarah's bedside, holding her small hand. "I'm home now." "We all are," Grace smiled. Outside, construction crews began their work at the church. The community center was becoming reality, and Michael's song, finally complete after 9 years, played on, a bridge between past and future, loss and redemption, broken hearts and healing souls. But there was still one more chapter to write in their story, one more Christmas miracle to witness. 1 year later, Christmas Eve. The Michael Pierce Community Center sparkled with holiday lights. Where the old church once stood, a modern complex now housed dozens of families, a state-of-the-art music school, and the restored church sanctuary. "Ready for your big night?" Jonathan asked Sarah, who was practicing in the new concert hall. "Almost." She adjusted her violin strings. "Is Grandma Grace ready?" Grace entered, looking healthier than she had in years. "The choir's warming up, and wait until you see who came." The hall was filling quickly. In the front row, Richard Sterling sat with other community leaders. The story of the center's creation had made national news, inspiring similar projects across the country. "Frank's here too," Grace said. With a surprise, Frank walked in carrying a large box. "Found these in storage. Jennifer kept everything." Inside were programs from Michael's old concerts, photos of him teaching, and newspaper clippings about his community work. "Perfect for the memorial wall," Jonathan said. Sarah picked up a photo of her father at the piano. "He's watching tonight. I can feel it." The concert hall filled to capacity. Children from the music school, many once homeless, now sat with their instruments. Elderly residents from the center's housing wing found their seats, some accompanied by grandchildren they were raising. "Time to begin," Grace announced, taking her place as choir director. Sarah stood center stage, her violin ready. Jonathan sat at Michael's restored piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," Father Michael addressed the crowd. 1 year ago today, a miracle began with a simple melody. Tonight, we celebrate not just Christmas, but the power of music to heal hearts and rebuild lives. The lights dimmed. Sarah began to play the opening notes of Michael's song. The choir joined in, their voices stronger than ever. Jonathan's fingers found the piano keys, adding the harmony Michael had written 9 years ago. In the audience, Richard Sterling wiped his eyes. Next to him, the social worker who'd once threatened to separate the family nodded in approval. Grace directed the choir with confident gestures, her health fully restored. The genetic condition that had threatened both her and Sarah was now properly managed, thanks to the medical wing added to the center. Frank stood at the back, watching the family he'd helped reunite. On the memorial wall behind him, photos told their story. Michael teaching music, Jennifer in her graduation gown, Sarah's first day at the center school, the groundbreaking ceremony, and the day Grace officially adopted Sarah with Jonathan as legal co-guardian. As the music reached its crescendo, Sarah played the final part. the section Michael had written on his last Christmas. The melody soared through the hall, a testament to love that transcended time and loss. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Grace hugged Sarah as Jonathan joined them on stage. "Look," Sarah pointed to the back of the hall. A shaft of light from the setting sun broke through the windows, illuminating Michael's photo on the memorial wall. "He's saying Merry Christmas," Sarah whispered. Jonathan looked at his granddaughter, at Grace, at the community they'd built together. "No more cold hearts," he said. "No more lost souls." "The center's just the beginning," Grace added. "Other cities are following our model." Sarah picked up her violin again. "One more time?" The choir stood ready. Jonathan returned to the piano. Grace raised her hands to conduct. Michael's melody filled the air once more, but this time it wasn't just a song. It was a promise kept, a family restored, and a reminder that miracles still happen, especially at Christmas. Outside, snow began to fall on the new center, on the families within, on the restored church that had started it all. And somewhere between heaven and earth, a father's love lived on through his music, through his daughter, through a song that had finally brought everyone home. After the concert, the celebration continued in the center's main hall. Children from the music school performed impromptu shows for their families, while elderly residents shared stories of how the center had changed their lives. "Mr. Pierce," a young mother approached Jonathan, "because of your scholarship program, my daughter can finally take piano lessons. She practices every day." Jonathan watched the woman's daughter playing with Sarah, both girls sharing sheet music and giggles. "Music belongs to everyone," he said. "My son taught me that." Grace was surrounded by her former choir members from the church, now successful teenagers who'd returned for the concert. "Remember when we sang in the cold?" one boy asked. "Now look at us." "The center saved more than our music," another added. "It saved our families." Frank approached with more surprising news. "The governor's office called. They want to use our center as a model for a statewide program. Senior housing combined with youth music education." Michael's vision growing beyond Hartford, Grace smiled. Sarah ran up to them, excited. "Grandpa, come see. We found something in the old piano bench. You're in the music room." Sarah opened a hidden compartment in Michael's restored piano. Inside was a dusty notebook. "Your father's composition book," Jonathan realized. The pages contained more than music. Michael had written his dreams for the future, plans for teaching, and notes about a community center, exactly like the one they'd built. "He saw it all," Grace whispered. 9 years ago. Richard Sterling joined them, holding a document. The city council voted unanimously. The entire block is now designated as a cultural heritage site. No one can ever tear this place down. "We're expanding too," Frank added. "The building next door? It's being converted into a medical research center, focusing on the genetic heart condition Sarah and Grace share. Doctors want to study why the same gene that causes health problems also seems to enhance musical ability." Sarah played a few notes on the piano. Daddy knew music and healing belonged together. More families arrived for the Christmas Eve dinner, a new tradition at the center. The dining hall filled with people from all walks of life. Wealthy donors sitting next to formerly homeless families, musicians teaching children between courses, elderly residents sharing wisdom with young parents. "Remember that first night at the church steps?" Grace asked Jonathan. "When you gave us $500? "Best investment I ever made," he smiled. The evening continued with impromptu performances. Sarah and her young students played carols while the choir sang. Jonathan found himself sharing the piano bench with aspiring musicians, teaching them the way Michael once had. Father Michael stood to make an announcement. "Thanks to your generous donations tonight, we're opening 3 more music schools in neighboring cities. Michael's legacy will help even more families." As midnight approached, Sarah gathered everyone for one final performance. But this time she had a surprise. "I've been working on something," she said. "An addition to Daddy's song." She began to play, and everyone recognized Michael's melody. But then it transformed, incorporating themes of hope, renewal, and joy, Sarah's own contribution to her father's masterpiece. The choir joined spontaneously, followed by other musicians. The music swelled, filling not just the hall but seeming to embrace the entire city. Grace conducted with tears in her eyes. Jonathan played along on the piano, his heart full. Frank filmed everything, ensuring this moment would be preserved for future generations. As the final notes faded, Sarah looked up at Michael's photo on the wall. "Now it's really complete, Daddy. Your song, your dream, your family." The clock struck midnight. Christmas Day had arrived. Outside, families departed with promises to return. Children clutched new instruments donated by the center, and elderly residents walked proudly to their comfortable apartments. "Quite a change from last Christmas," Richard Sterling observed. "The kind of change money can't buy," Jonathan replied. Sarah yawned, tired but happy. Grace wrapped her in a warm embrace. "Ready to go home?" Jonathan asked. Sarah looked around the center, at the music rooms where she taught younger children, the memorial wall honoring her father, the community her family had built. "We are home," she said simply. As they walked through the quiet halls, Sarah played soft notes on her violin. The melody drifted through the building like a blessing, a promise kept, a dream fulfilled. Michael's vision had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. His song had not only healed his family, but had created a symphony of hope for an entire community. And in the gentle Christmas snow, as lights twinkled and music echoed, the true meaning of family, faith, and the American dream lived on. Not in wealth or power, but in the harmony of hearts united by love, purpose, and the healing power of music. The center stood as a testament to this truth, a beacon of light in the darkness, a place where broken lives were mended and new dreams were born. Just as Michael had written in his final composition, just as Jennifer had trusted in her letters, just as Sarah had known in her heart, love, expressed through music, could rebuild anything, even a frozen heart, even a fractured family, even a lost soul. And that was the greatest Christmas miracle of all. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that miracles still happen. What would you do if you found your long-lost family member? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartwarming story of faith, family, and redemption. Every week, we bring you stories that prove it's never too late for a second chance at love and happiness. Remember, sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in life's hardest challenges.